Yes, thank you, Stephanie, and also welcome everyone from me. Thank you for joining us. I know it's early morning in some places, late evening in other places, and everything in between. So thank you for being here. My name is Irina Todorova, and as Stephanie mentioned, and I'm very, very happy to introduce our webinar today on the topic of coaching for employee engagement, presented by Gordon Spence and Christopher Niemiec. I'd like to let you know that the webinar is part of the Institute of Coaching Research series of webinars. We periodically present the research conducted by the Harness Scholars, who receive grants to conduct different research projects to the support of the Harness Foundation and the Institute of Coaching. So if you're interested in learning more about our grants and conducting coaching research, certainly look at the grant section in our website, and also you are welcome to contact me with any questions. So today we will have about 40 to 45 minutes of presentation from our Harness Scholars. They've been working on this project for about 2 years now. And then we will have about 30 minutes for questions and comments and discussion and interactions. So welcome, Gordon and Chris. I'd like to introduce you. Dr. Gordon Spence is a psychologist who works in both academia and private practice. He is currently Program Director of the Masters of Business Coaching in Sydney Business School at the University of Wollongong, Australia. And he has been in maintaining a private coaching practice also for over a decade, working with executive workplace coaching and coach training, also providing coach training services. His doctorate in coaching psychology is from the University of Sydney, and Dr. Gordon Spence also lectures on the psychology of peak performance, leadership, evidence-based coaching, workplace well-being, and the application of positive psychology within organizations. So welcome, Gordon, to the webinar today. And we also have Dr. Christopher Niemiec with us today, who is a senior lecturer and research associate in the Department of Clinical and Social Sciences and Psychology at the University of Rochester in New York. His work is in the area of human motivation, emotion, and personality in social context. He has been using self-determination theory, and we'll talk about that today, to examine the nature and functional significance of autonomy. He uses both experimental as well as cross-sectional longitudinal designs, and again, we'll talk about that today. He's worked in different contexts in different countries, and in 2013, he was awarded Professor of the Year in Social Sciences at the University of Rochester. Welcome, Chris. Thank you both for being here, and now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Gordon Spence to start our seminar, our webinar for today.
Thank you, Irina. Well, it's wonderful to be with you today to be able to talk to you about the research we've been conducting. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending on where you are in the world. My name's Gordon Spence, and as Erin has mentioned, I'm the Program Director of the Master of Business Coaching, which is a 3-year postgraduate degree focused on the acquisition of coaching skills and knowledge for application in business and organisational contexts at the University of Wollongong. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about a collaborative project that my colleague Chris Niemiec and I have been running over the past couple of years. And what we've tried to do today is not present all the data that we've collected, but rather present a portion of it and highlight some of the more interesting findings. Unfortunately, though, as we're still writing up the work, we won't be making the slides available after today's talk. However, the data that we do present, plus a follow-up to the main study, should hopefully be published by either the end of this year or early 2017. So you won't have too long to wait before you would see a full write-up of this research. So what I'd like to do before we tuck in is just acknowledge a couple of things. Two important contributions to the project should be noted, and I guess the most obvious one is the support that's been received from the Institute of Coaching. So we received 50% of the budget funding for the project from a Harnish grant. So that was wonderful and was greatly appreciated. But also the project's supported by a matched cash and in-kind contribution from United Technologies BIS Australasia. And they're a large building and industrial systems company, which some of you may know. And the UTC was keen to participate in this program as part of its employee engagement strategy. And as such, they allowed us access to their employees and also provided logistical and administrative support throughout the project. So particular thanks go to Chris Gildersleeve, the Director of Employee Engagement, with his help in completing the project. And I guess for many of you, I'm sure you know that employee engagement has been on the scientific agenda now for some time. Its salience for organisations is fairly clear, I think, in that gaining more of the head, hands and heart of employees is widely thought to provide organisations with a purposeful, proactive workforce that, all other things being equal, should outperform most others, and so there's a competitive advantage argument to the development of employee engagement. And the use of executive and workplace coaching for generating various qualities of engagement is fairly well widespread now. But despite this, there are relatively few studies that have been conducted to understand whether coaching does impact engagement, and if it does, how that might occur. And so this study was conceived to try and explore both of these questions. And in doing so, the research is really focused on what appears to conform to what Eric DeHaan was discussing a couple of years ago in respect of a new kind of outcome study, one that not only assesses the outcomes of coaching, which are now fairly commonly reported in the literature, but also seeking to understand something of the processes that are associated with those outcomes or such outcomes. And that's far less commonly reported. And so the study that we designed was designed to really have a look at some of the psychological mechanisms that might underpin some of these coaching outcomes. And so I think there's many factors that are thought to drive engagement. Some of those can include things like the nature of the work that people are engaged in, brand loyalty for employees that are working for particular companies that have iconic brands, and that can engender a sense of engagement. Rewards and recognition, of course, are well known or thought to promote engagement and commitment. Personality characteristics are also another driver of engagement potentially. So there are many, many things that potentially drive engagement. One factor that also seems to be important is perceived organisational support, or the degree to which an employee would feel that the organisation values their contribution and cares about their general well-being. And so whilst it's clearly important that organisations work to meet the material needs of employees through all the usual things, good pay, health benefits, etc. This study was really concentrating on the importance of meeting basic psychological needs of employees, and most particularly autonomy, and Chris is going to expand on that in a minute. So given that coaches often become an important part of a manager or employee's social context, it seems fairly reasonable to propose that coaching in the work domain might produce similar outcomes to those that have been produced in other domains like health and education. So this brings us neatly to a point where some theoretical background to our project is needed, and for that I will now hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Gordon. So it's a real pleasure to be here on this webinar. And as you all know, we're talking about coaching for employee engagement. And in many ways, at the core of engagement, regardless of the domain, is motivation. And motivation has been a long-standing topic of both theoretical and empirical inquiry within psychology, almost since the inception of psychology itself. Now, of course, over the decades, interest in human motivation has waxed and waned within psychology. You know, at some points in our history, there has been a very strong level of interest in human motivation and why we do what we do. And at other times in our field's history, there's been a very low level of interest in human motivation. But today, interest in human motivation is booming. And indeed, applications of human motivation cut across psychological subdisciplines and domains of life. Think about all of the important aspects of your life. Think about all the important domains of your life and ask yourself, does motivation matter? I mean, to be sure, motivation matters in our relationships. Motivation matters in our parenting. Motivation matters in sport. Motivation matters in healthcare. Motivation matters in education. And to be sure, motivation matters in work and organizational life. Now, within psychology, two distinct views of motivation have been prevalent. The so-called traditional view considers motivation to be a unitary concept, one that differs in amount rather than type. Within the traditional view, some people have a high level of motivation, whereas other people have a very low level of motivation. And the assumption within the traditional view is the more motivation a person has, the better off that person will be. The better off that person will be psychologically, physically, socially, and behaviorally. Of course, also within the traditional view, it doesn't matter how we get other people or ourselves to be motivated. You know, we dangle carrots in front of the donkey and we get the donkey to move. We hit the donkey on the backside with a stick and we get the donkey to move. All that matters within the traditional view is that the person has a high level of motivation. In contrast, the differentiated view considers there to be distinct types of motivation that function very differently. And self-determination theory, which is the theoretical framework that Gordon and I used in this study, views motivation from a differentiated perspective. One type of motivation is referred to as intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation can be defined as doing an activity because the behavior is inherently satisfying and enjoyable. With intrinsic motivation, there are no separable outcomes or contingencies that reinforce the behavior. Rather, the activity is inherently satisfying, and as a result, such behaviors occur spontaneously, and they oftentimes manifest as exploration and play. To see intrinsic motivation, look at what children do. I mean, by nature, children explore, they play, and they manipulate their environment simply for the sake of doing so. Children don't require rewards to play. Children don't require threats of punishment to play. They play because it's fun and enjoyable. They play because it's intrinsically motivated. Now, think about those times in your life when you experience intrinsic motivation. How does it feel? I imagine that when you're intrinsically motivated, you have emotions such as interest, excitement, and enjoyment. Indeed, intrinsic motivation feels good because intrinsic motivation is good for us, and it is the prototype of autonomous, self-determined behavior. Intrinsic motivation is a very beautiful experience, and I hope that you have a lot of it in your life. At the same time, intrinsic motivation is a very delicate experience. What I mean by that is intrinsic motivation is easily impacted by the world around us. What research has shown over the last 45 years is that certain aspects of the environment undermine intrinsic motivation, and other aspects of the environment enhance intrinsic motivation. For example, contingent rewards undermine intrinsic motivation. You know, let's say, for example, that you love to play soccer. You would play soccer just for the sake of doing so. It's fun, it's satisfying, and it's enjoyable. But as some of us may have experiences with, sometimes our parents think, well, when we're children, well, I know how to get my kid motivated. I'll promise him or her a reward for doing the game or for scoring goals or whatever it may be. And over time, what starts to happen is that contingent reward takes our mind off of the game itself. We become more focused on doing the activity to get the reward rather than on doing the activity for the sake of the activity itself. And also what happens with contingent rewards is that we start to feel like a pawn. We start to feel like someone else has an agenda for us. Someone else wants us to think, to feel, or to behave in a particular way. So contingent rewards undermine intrinsic motivation. Also, threats of punishment undermine intrinsic motivation. I mean, none of us really enjoy our experience when there's some salient threat hanging over us. What else? Deadlines. Does anyone really like deadlines? Does anyone really like deadlines that are very tight and pressuring and almost impossible to meet? Absolutely not. Deadlines also undermine intrinsic motivation. So too does surveillance. Close monitoring and surveillance tends to undermine the inherent satisfaction that we have when we're intrinsically motivated. And then finally, evaluations. Even when the evaluations are unequivocally positive, the very fact of doing something in order to get an evaluation undermines our intrinsic motivation. In contrast, providing choice, and what I mean by that is meaningful choice, enhances intrinsic motivation. And so from a theoretical perspective, this brings us to a very important question, and that is why. Why do rewards, threats of punishment, deadlines, surveillance, and evaluations all undermine intrinsic motivation, whereas providing choice enhances intrinsic motivation? And from a self-determination theory perspective, the answer is all people, regardless of our gender, age, culture, or social class, all people have a basic psychological need for autonomy. We all need to feel choiceful. We all need to feel self-determined. We all need to feel volitional. We all need to feel as though we self-govern our lives. Other research has shown that negative feedback undermines intrinsic motivation, whereas positive feedback enhances intrinsic motivation. And again, this brings us to a very important question. Why? And the answer is, in addition to having a basic psychological need for autonomy, all people have a basic psychological need for competence. We all need to feel capable. We all need to feel effective. We all need to feel masterful in what we do. And when we feel autonomous, when we feel competent, we have a greater likelihood of experiencing intrinsic motivation. Now, intrinsic motivation tends to decline with age. And a second type of motivation is referred to as extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation refers to doing an activity because it leads to a separable outcome or consequence, such as obtaining a reward or avoiding a punishment. Indeed, extrinsic motivation characterizes those behaviors that we do that are not inherently fun and enjoyable. And a majority of the behaviors that we do as adults are extrinsically motivated. An important question then is whether extrinsic motivation can be internalized. Can extrinsic motivation be internalized so that we come to a place of doing the behavior, which is not fun and satisfying, but nonetheless we come to do the behavior with a sense of volition, autonomy, and self-determination. Now, within self-determination theory, internalization refers to the natural, active process of coming to endorse the value of extrinsically motivated behaviors. And internalization is necessary for the self-initiation and maintenance of important behaviors. What we've also found within self-determination theory is that people tend to internalize aspects of the environment that are endorsed by important others. I mean, think about all of those important aspects of who you are. think about your values, think about your beliefs, think about your attitudes. I'm willing to bet that with a little bit of reflection, you'd come to the conclusion that a large part of who you are is a function of people in your life to whom you feel close. We tend to internalize the values of our parents, of our peers, of our romantic partners, to the extent that we feel close to those individuals. And again, this leads us to an important question, and that is why. From a self-determination theory perspective, in addition to having basic psychological needs for autonomy and competence, all people have a basic psychological need for relatedness. When we feel close to others, when we feel connected with others, when we feel that others care for us without strings attached, we tend to internalize other people's values. And so with support for and satisfaction of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, we tend to internalize the value of extrinsically motivated behaviors, and we also tend to flourish and thrive psychologically, socially, and physically. Now, within self-determination theory, there are different types of extrinsic motivation. And these different types of extrinsic motivation exist along a continuum of internalization. At the far left of the continuum, the least autonomous, the least internalized type of extrinsic motivation is called external regulation. With external regulation, we do the behavior in order to obtain a reward or avoid a punishment. There's some contingency of reinforcement in the environment that organizes and directs our behavior. As the process of internalization proceeds, the next type of extrinsic motivation is called introjected regulation. With introjected regulation, the contingency of reinforcement that used to be in the environment is now inside us. In the same way that the environment used to control our behavior, now we control our own behavior. We control ourselves by promising rewards such as self-esteem and pride and self-aggrandizement, and we punish ourselves by making ourselves feel guilty and ashamed when we don't live up to our high, rigid standards. Both external regulation and introjected regulation are relatively controlled types of motivation. As the process of internalization proceeds, a third type of extrinsic motivation is called identified regulation. With identified regulation, we understand the value and the importance of the behavior, and we do the behavior because it's personally valuable and important. And then finally, the process of internalization is complete with integrated regulation. With integrated regulation, not only do we understand the value and the importance of the behavior, but the value and the importance of the behavior is synthesized and aligned with other important aspects of ourself. Essentially, the behavior fits. And both identified regulation and integrated regulation are relatively autonomous types of extrinsic motivation. Now, with this view of internalization in mind, within self-determination theory there are two broad categories, two broad types of motivation. Autonomous motivation means to endorse one's behavior fully. When we're autonomous, we step outside of what we are doing, we reflect on what we are doing, and we ask ourselves, do I endorse my behavior? And to the extent that we are autonomous, the answer to that question unequivocally is yes. As a result, with autonomous motivation, there are accompanying experiences of choice and volition. Your behavior is perceived to be self-determined and self-directed. And as I've already suggested, intrinsic motivation, integrated regulation, and identified regulation are all described as autonomous forms of motivation. They're all experienced as choiceful and as volitional. In contrast, controlled motivation means to feel coerced into behavior by external or internal forces. With controlled motivation, there's a feeling of pressure to think, to feel, or to behave in certain ways and according to someone else's agenda. As a result, with controlled motivation, there are accompanying experiences of pressure and obligation. Your behavior is something that you should do. Your behavior is something that you must do. Your behavior is something that you ought to do. Your behavior is something that you have to do. And again, as I've already suggested, external regulation and introjected regulation are both described as controlled forms of motivation. They're both experienced as pressured and as coerced. At this point, you may be asking, what's the big deal about autonomous motivation? I mean, again, a really prevalent concept within psychology is that motivation really is just about how much of it you have. It really doesn't matter if you're autonomous or controlled so much as you're motivated. But of course, within self-determination theory, we do believe that autonomous motivation confers functional benefits across a variety of aspects of life and in a variety of life domains. And so what I'd like to do is review some research from self-determination theory that explores the importance of autonomous motivation at work. For example, when employees experience higher levels of autonomous motivation, they report lower levels of family alienation and lower levels of emotional exhaustion. When employees are autonomous, they feel less distanced from their families. There's less of a disconnect between the family life and the work life. Also, they're less burnt out. They're less exhausted by what they do at work. Also, higher levels of autonomous motivation are associated with higher levels of work satisfaction, as well as lower levels of turnover and tension. This is a very important point to make. When employees are more autonomous, they desire to leave the company less. And this not only benefits the employee, but it also benefits the company and the organization at large. Turnover has a huge cost associated with it. Higher levels of autonomous motivation are also associated with lower levels of depersonalization and higher levels of personal accomplishment. The idea is when people are autonomous at work, they feel less like cogs in a machine and more like individuals, more like human beings. And they accomplish more, and they feel like they accomplish more on the job. And then finally, autonomous motivation is associated with higher levels of job satisfaction and job commitment. Employees enjoy their work more, and they feel more committed to it to the extent that they're autonomous. Finally, autonomous motivation also matters for people who are unemployed. When people are unemployed and they feel autonomous in searching for a new job, that autonomous motivation is associated with higher job search intensity and higher levels of self-actualization. In contrast, controlled motivation for searching for a new job is associated with more negative experience, less general health, less life satisfaction, and less self-actualization. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Gordon.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay, thanks, Chris. So that's I think a really nice summary of the theoretical backdrop for the study. And really, I guess what we were wanting to do was to explore the question: could coaching change the motivational underpinnings of people's important work goals, or in other words, the reasons why they might have been striving for them? And so the study was set up primarily to test that. And so what I want to do now is to start to talk you through the study itself, to talk about how we conducted it, and also to present some of the research findings, and then to have a short discussion about those findings, and then open up for questions. And so, as I mentioned, we conducted this study within an Australian subsidiary of a large multinational company. And 107 managers registered interest in participating in this particular study. 50 of those managers were assigned to a coaching condition, 57 were assigned to a control group. We ran the coaching trial with 2 cohorts, so there were 2 25-person coaching conditions that ran sequentially. So we ran in the first part of the year 1 cohort, and then in the second part of the year we ran the second cohort. Each cohort commenced the coaching program with a 1-day workshop which was focused on managing the staff engagement, and at that workshop people received a little bit of, there was a sort of a work style session where people started to understand staff engagement through an SDT lens. They also engaged in some skill development. They reflected on things that they would like to do within their teams when they went back to work, and they also started to think about setting some goals, which was a primer for the coaching, which then commenced shortly after, and managers were then participated in 5-hour-long coaching sessions over a course of 10 weeks. We would like to have provided a greater level of coaching in terms of number of sessions provided. However, for logistical reasons and from a cost perspective, that was prohibitive. So we needed to go with something we felt would be a decent amount to at least start to affect the sorts of change that we hypothesised may take place. Important to mention also that the coaches that took part in this study were tertiary qualified, so there was a team of 5 coaches who all had tertiary level qualifications in either coaching psychology or business coaching, and also at least 2 years of organisational coaching experience as well. And as they delivered the coaching and worked with the participating managers, we also provided as I guess a quality control mechanism, and also to maintain fidelity to the intervention of need supportive coaching, we provided group supervision for the coaches, so that they attended supervision sessions either in person or in a technologically assisted way around once every 3 or 4 weeks throughout the coaching phases. In terms of data collection, data was collected pre and post coaching. We used a variety of measures. I won't go through them all in detail, but one of the things that is important to mention, just on the back of Chris's description of SDT, and also the slide that you may recall, the Continuum of Relative Autonomy, where Chris talked about 4 different types of extrinsic motivation, varying in their levels of internalisation. Well, the measure of relative autonomy, the RAI, was a measure that we took, and it's an index that's created by aggregating participants' internalisation ratings on their most important work goals. So in this phase of the data capture, participants were articulating their most important work goal and then rating that goal in terms of its levels of external, introjected, identified and integrated regulation, and from that we produced an RAI score, and that was included in the data set. So that's an important one just to bear in mind. We also took a measure of perceived competence in relation to those goals. We also took measures of work and wellbeing outcomes, the work outcomes including work engagement and intention to quit, and wellbeing outcomes, somatic symptom burden, and mental ill health, which were measures of physical and mental health. Okay, so the hypotheses for the study. The primary hypothesis, based on our knowledge of the literature, was that participants in the coaching intervention would report greater internalisation of important work goals compared to controls. So really what we're interested to see was, did coaching facilitate internalisation across the coaching period? And then in addition to that, we're also interested to examine the process by which any changes in relative autonomy might impact a small number of work and wellbeing related variables. And so for this, we took guidance from previous research and decided to test a model that had been previously written up by SDT researchers. And in the model that we tested, we were looking at the effect that RAI might have it being mediated by perceived competence and its ability to then influence other variables, and that influenced the selection of the model. So we're interested here in the hypothesis here was that the SDT model would fit the data whereby changes in relative autonomy would predict changes in perceived competence, and that changes in perceived competence would then predict the changes in work and wellbeing outcomes. So what I'm going to do now is work through some data slides. We've tried not to bombard people with numbers, but I've tried to do this a bit more graphically. But I'll move through them relatively quickly so that we can then get to some conclusions. So in terms of the results, one of the things that we did check was that whilst we weren't able to randomly assign participants to treatment and control groups, we're still able to see that the quasi-randomisation still produced groups that were equivalent on the time one study variables, and that was an important thing for us to check. In terms of our first hypothesis, you can see from the graph there that the mean changes in relative autonomy for the coaching group increased. There was a slight decrease for the control group, but overall the results from that particular analysis and the hierarchical regression confirmed that first hypothesis, that the coaching condition had facilitated internalisation. It's perhaps worth just noting that there was a decrease in the control conditions. So in other words, at the end of the coaching period, even though those control groups hadn't had any coaching, their RAI decreased. This wasn't something we were necessarily anticipating, but it occurred. I'm thinking about it. Some of the things that we have thought were possible explanations for this was that at the time this coaching program was running out across the course of this year, BIS Australasia were engaged in Sydney at least in a rather large restructure and relocation, so there was a lot happening within the organisation at this time, and it would have been a time when a lot of people were being told what to do, and so we think that there's a possible explanation for this, that the decreases in RAI, people was perhaps reflecting the fact that the environment was not supportive or autonomy in any natural sense. So moving on to hypothesis 2. To test this hypothesis, we performed a correlation analysis using residual change scores, and we got the following correlation table. But for ease of presentation, as I've mentioned, I wanted to just talk you through these key correlations in a graphical way. And so what we see here is that relative autonomy was not significantly related and did not predict changes in work engagement, at least not directly. When we look at correlations between relative autonomy and somatic symptom burden, which is a measure of physical ill health or distress, we see a strong positive correlation, 0.34. Suggesting that the levels of autonomy do predict levels of somatic symptom burden at a 0.01 level of significance. When you look at intention to quit, there's a positive correlation that was non-significant. However, this was an interesting one to us, as this was a positive relationship which wasn't expected. So it's saying that as people's level of autonomy increases, so does their intention to quit. One possible explanation for this, although it wasn't what we were expecting, is that perhaps as managers were becoming more autonomous in the way they were thinking about their work, but they also became more inclined to consider their overall level of satisfaction with their job and may have started to consider other possible changes. that's a potential exploration there. And then finally, the relationship between RAI and mental ill health, which was measured with the depression, anxiety and stress scale, showed a non-significant negative correlation, so it was not predicting changes in mental ill health. In terms of the relationship between RAI and perceived competence, now this is quite a well-established relationship, and in our data set it was also there was also a significant positive relationship seen between these two variables. And so this suggests that as managers became more autonomous, they also began to feel more capable and confident in their abilities. And so just focusing now on perceived competence and how it related to some of these outcome variables, we see that changes in perceived competence now were significantly related to changes in all the outcomes except intention to quit. And so what we then wanted to do, having established that there were positive relationships, significant relationships here, was move on and to test a model of the simultaneous relations between these multiple variables. And what we wanted to do was assess the goodness of fit of the SDT model that's been previously supported in other studies. And the results from a structural equation model revealed that we had a model that had excellent fit. And then what we did was move on and test then the indirect effects of relative autonomy on these outcome variables through the variable perceived competence. And so the next 4 slides are about these indirect effects. So if we just have a look at the relationships leading to work engagement. For work engagement, there was a significant indirect effect observed from RAI to work engagement through perceived competence. So this suggests that facilitating autonomy in employees does impact engagement, but not directly. It seems to occur as a consequence of increases in perceived competence. In other words, in this model, autonomy and competence seem to work together to shift engagement. For somatic symptom burden, which is the measure of physical ill health and distress, a significant direct and indirect effect was observed, and so this suggests that increases in autonomy can directly reduce various forms of physical distress, and that's an effect that also occurs indirectly through perceived competence as well. For intention to quit, which had that somewhat unexpected finding that I mentioned earlier, no significant indirect effect was found. And this is a portion of our results that I think we're going to need to revisit, as there's the observation of the positive relationship between RAI and intention to quit, which we didn't predict, and we're going to need to look at a little more closely. And finally, there was a marginally significant indirect effect observed for relative autonomy to mental ill health through perceived competence. And this suggests, a little like work engagement, that increased autonomy does positively impact mental ill health, but not directly. It occurs as a consequence of increases in perceived competence. So in other words, autonomy and competence seem to work together to improve these aspects of wellbeing. So that's all the data that we wanted to present at this time, just bearing in mind that we want to get to some of your questions. So we might start to wrap up and just take another 5 minutes to do that. So as mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, the explicit use of theory in coaching is something that isn't commonly reported. And in this study, what we attempted to do was to test an SDT-informed coaching intervention and see if we could detect what some of the psychological mechanisms that might be at play in that intervention. And so what we seem to be finding is that a coaching intervention underpinned in this way seemed to facilitate greater ownership over important work goals for these managers, and that as autonomy increased as a consequence of receiving need-supportive coaching, so did perceived competence, with a variety of positive work-related outcomes, including greater work engagement. I guess the question becomes, well, so what? And for us, the argument would be that coaching interventions should emphasise the use of autonomy supportive practices and need supportive practices in order to activate downstream effects of the sort that we've just been describing that benefit both organisations, employees and organisations. And just to give that statement a little more colour, I think it's worth just spending a couple of minutes just thinking about what these need supportive practices look like in the workplace. And so for that, I was just going to throw back to Chris for a quick description.
Thanks, Gordon. So as Gordon and I have been suggesting, and as I think our data has been suggesting as well, it's really critical for managers and for coaches to provide support for employees' basic psychological needs in the workplace. And at its core, need support is an interpersonal style. It's not a set of techniques. It's not a set of reprogramming that a manager does to an employee, for example, but it's an interpersonal style. It's a way of relating to others in ways that respects their basic psychological needs. And so to support autonomy, we begin by relating to the employee from the employee's perspective. The idea is to really take interest in, to elicit, and to acknowledge the employee's perspective. Take interest in her thoughts, in his feelings about what's occurring at work, both in the employee and around the employee. And while relating to the employee from the employee's perspective, we also encourage self-initiation and choice. The idea is there are goals in the workplace, and at the same time there are many ways to attain those goals. How I may attain the goal may differ from how my employee may attain the goal. And so the idea is to encourage self-initiation. Try this out for yourself. Experiment, explore. You may encounter some shortcomings. You may encounter a little bit of failure, and that's okay. That's part of what life is. And so encourage self-initiation and choice. Now, need-supportive practice is not laissez-faire. It's not do-anything permissiveness. At times, we make requests of our employees, and at times we set limits on our employees. But to support autonomy, when we make requests and when we set limits on our employees' behavior, it's also critical to provide a meaningful, clear rationale for those requests and for the limits. Essentially, we want the employees to internalize the value of the limit or the value of the request. And it's not likely at all that that internalization will occur unless there's a meaningful rationale for the limit and for the request. And then finally, minimize use of controlling language. Controlling language is all around us in our culture, and it tends to manifest as should, must, ought, have to. Think about those times in your life when other people tell you you should think, feel, or behave in this way. How do you feel? You tend to feel like a pawn. You tend to feel like someone else is pulling the strings on your life and that someone else has an agenda for you. As managers, let's not be one more controlling person toward our employees. Let's refrain from controlling language and rather encourage and respect the preferences and the ways of being for our employees. It's also important to support competence. And one way to support competence is by creating optimal challenges. Optimal challenges are challenges that are just a little bit beyond our employees' current skills and capacity. We grow psychologically with optimal challenges. We're stretched psychologically with optimal challenges. The idea is to continually go just a bit beyond your current capacity. And with optimal challenges, we develop more capability and more competence in our pursuits. Also, to support competence, we give accurate, effectiveness-relevant informational feedback. The idea is you engage in a discussion with your employee about how things are going. And in the context of that discussion, we give feedback that's accurate, but also affectance relevant. Here's how you're doing. Here's what you may consider doing to improve, or here's what you may consider doing to maintain your high level of performance. And then finally, relatedness. To support relatedness, we work to develop a warm, empathic, non-judgmental relationship with our employees. And for me, the real key here is non-judgmental. Many of us have people in our lives who are more than willing to pass judgment on us. Let's not be one more judgmental person toward our employees. Let's prize and cherish and respect our employees for who they are, without judgment, without strings attached.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So just to wrap up, I think it's true when you look at the coaching literature that many people in one way or another will tend to argue that coaching is about helping others to generate self-motivation that can be released towards the successful pursuit of goals and or behaviour change over time. So I think, in our view, if that's true, then internalisation is key to any coaching endeavour, any coaching program, or any coaching engagement. And given the understanding that SDT offers about the role of internalisation in optimal human functioning, and the rather nice thing about a theory such as self-determination theory is that it's not just a theory, there's quite a back catalogue of research to support some of what it proposes. Then I think it becomes a theory that has a sensible starting point from which to both consider in the design of coaching intervention and to also formulate future research questions that can add real value, I think, to the knowledge base that's currently developing in respect of coaching. So that's all we wanted to present to you today. I know we've covered a lot of territory. There were many things we would like to have taken more time to expand on, but we hope that at least you've got a sense of what the research was designed to do and what we seem to be finding. I should just mention too that there is a follow-up, and I did allude to it earlier. There is a follow-up being done to this main study, which is currently also being worked on at the moment, which is a more of a qualitative follow-up 12 months after the coaching intervention to examine what sleeper effects, what delayed effects, delayed insights might have occurred for coachee or participant managers from this coaching program. So we hope to have something, well, I know we've got some interesting data in that project and we'll be writing that up towards the back end of this year as well. So I'll stop talking at this point and allow Irina to pick things up and we can begin to answer some questions.
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much, Gordon and Chris, for this really wonderful and engaging presentation. I've had the opportunity to follow the development of this project over the past couple of years, and it's really wonderful to see it come together. And I know you have additional things to work on and finish up, but I really appreciate the way that you've illustrated the synchronicity between the different parts of this project and the study, the overarching theoretical framework based on self-determination theory, the research design, the hypotheses, the measures, the variables that you've identified, and as well as, of course, very importantly, the approach to coaching and the reflection on what this all means for coaching practice. So it's been a pleasure to see this coherent connection between all these elements in your project. And we will go now to some of the questions. Thank you. The questions have been coming in through the chat function. I will address as many as we can. We have about 15 minutes for questions, but also we are happy to then collect them and share them with our presenters and summarize some feedback, some responses, and reflections on your questions and comments in case we don't get to all of them. But I'd also like to also encourage you to raise your hand through that function on the webinar, and we can unmute you, and we can also have a live discussion and questions and comments on the presentation. And so while this is, we're waiting for some hands to come through, raised hands to come through, I will address some of the points that have come in through the chat function. One of which is, the question is, what definition of work engagement did you use? So generally speaking, is what is the conceptualization of work engagement? And we know there are many different approaches to understanding work engagement as well as measuring it. So if you want to say a little bit more about the operationalization of work engagement and also potentially how you've measured it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It was something I meant to touch on when I spoke about the measures. So with work engagement, we utilised the conceptualisation associated with the Utrecht work engagement scale, the 2006 scale, where engagement is conceptualised as having 3 dimensions. Vigour, dedication, and absorption. So we use that 9-item measure as our work engagement variable.
Thank you. Is there a live question coming in?
Irina, I don't see any hands raised as of yet, and I know a lot of questions are coming in through the chat function, so that might be a preference this evening or this morning.
Right. I'll address those that are coming into the chat function. So there's a question here about the distinction between motivation and commitment. We know that I think that we know that motivation can be short-lived, transient, or temporary. It provides the inspiration and drive to initiate something, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee it will continue. Where do we fit commitment, the determination and dedication piece of it, as the enduring or long-term perseverance required to achieve completion in the approach to your project?
Chris, are you interested in answering that one?
I can start to say some words, and we'll see what unfolds. Look, I think commitment is more of a cognitive variable, whereas motivation is much more phenomenological and sort of involves the entire person. The two variables, commitment and motivation, are linked. They're correlated. They're related to each other. But within self-determination theory, commitment is an outcome associated with autonomous motivation. When people are more autonomous, when they commit more fully to the behavior, they're more likely to persist in the behavior for longer periods of time, and they're more likely to perform better at the behavior that they're persisting at. And I think that speaks a lot to commitment. But again, for us, commitment is likely to be more of an outcome of autonomous, volitional types of motivation.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's something that's also been borne out in a number of SDT-focused studies as well, that autonomous motivation tends to result in people investing more energy and effort towards important goals, and doing that persisting for longer, which picks up, I think, on what you're saying, Chris, that it becomes an outcome that the effort is sustained and able to be maintained for longer periods of time, because there's an internal source of energy, as it were, that's being tapped.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Chris and Gordon. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what does the actual coaching process look like, considering your whole framework. So you did talk about the the implications for the workplace and the relationships between managers, employees, and so on, and what needs support, for example, practice looks like in the workplace. And I'm sure there's a lot to be said about the commonalities there. But could you talk a little bit more about what the approach to the coaching was in the project that you did, and generally what's this coaching that needs supportive of autonomy, competence, and relatedness? What are some of the the specifics of it? I was very interested to see that relationship that you found, where you mentioned that autonomy and competence really work together in the models that you've identified in the analysis. But more, within the actual practice, if you could say, give us a bit more of an idea of what that type of coaching looks like, and what happens in the coaching. Also, clearly that wouldn't support all of these psychological needs, but how that then transfers to outside of the coaching, particularly in the workplace.
Okay, all right, yeah, good, great question. What we did with the coaching program was, it's important to understand that we weren't running a tightly or highly manualized coaching program that ran through a sequence of tightly defined steps. That's the first thing. We wanted to have the coaching program be ecologically valid, in the sense that coaches were able to spontaneously respond to whatever the coachees brought into the sessions, in the same way that you would see it unfold within any normal engagement. And so from a scientific point of view, there's clearly some difficulties associated with that, because it's from a replication point of view. But what we wanted to try and do, as I say, was run an ecologically valid study, but to maintain or give or allow the coaches to be able to faithfully provide need-supportive coaching. We did a few things. So in the selection of and recruitment of coaches to the study, one of the requirements, although I didn't mention it previously, was that they weren't theoretically naive, so that they had some understanding of SDT and its basic propositions, so that they were starting from an informed place. We then had a couple of information and / training sessions with coaches where we talked to them about the theory. We talked to them about the application of the theory within coaching and how that might play out with coachees, and what support for autonomy, competence and relatedness looked like within the context of a coaching conversation and a coaching engagement. And some of the need supportive practices that Chris mentioned earlier were very much to the fore in those sessions with those coaches. And then that was reinforced by the supervision sessions that were then provided periodically throughout both cohort coaching delivery phases, such that coaches could then bring issues or challenges that they were encountering with their clients. It could have been people who were feeling particularly weren't feeling particularly autonomous in the environment which they were, and they were feeling as though they didn't have many options, or were starting to feel a little bit helpless within the environment they were working within. And the task then was to supervise and work with coaches to help them think about how they could support their clients in ways that would reinforce people's sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness in their environment, such that they could then move back into the workplace in a way that would allow them to make decisions that would support not only their own needs but also the needs of those around them. So there were several layers to this, Irina, that were designed to try and maintain the integrity of the approach. Does that help?
Yes, definitely. Yes, it definitely clarifies, and also connects to some other questions that have come in that I will read through. So, for example, there's a comment that the findings from your project seem to support a basic tenet of coaching, in the sense of coaching to coach the person and not the problem, right? If you'd like to add to that this was a comment in our chat.
To coach the person and not the problem?
Rather, coaching the person rather than addressing a problem or defining a problem, right? In the coach relationship. It'd
be nice to understand that question a little bit more, but my take on it, I guess, is that, yeah, very much the coaching that we were encouraging coaches to be part of here was certainly one about working with the person to help them, I guess, find resources within themselves that they could then use to create their own solutions to address problems that they have. So we certainly would have been the very antithesis of this program and the underpinning philosophy to have in any way had the coaches starting to become problem solvers, for instance, but really support and provide a reflective space for coachees to come up with their solutions themselves by seeing more options, seeing greater levels of personal strength or greater opportunities than they might have been previously detecting, such that the options for them in problem solving would be greatly enhanced. I'm hoping that sort of gets at the nut of that question, but I'm not sure, Chris, are you finding another angle to that I'm not seeing?
No, I think you got it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Thank you. And when you were talking about how you're recruiting the coaches and the qualifications, there was a question here to clarify what tertiary qualifications mean for the coaches
Okay.
that you were...
So the coaches that participated were graduates from two programs, essentially. There were graduates from the Masters of Business Coaching program, which is the one that I look after at Sydney Business School, University of Wollongong, and then there were also graduates from the University of Sydney Coaching Psychology Masters program, which is the one that I used to teach within, but is headed up by Tony Grant and Michael Kavanagh, which many members of the Institute will probably have some familiarity.
Okay.
Well, we felt that was important for a number of reasons, because as I think I've already mentioned, part of the approach to delivering coaching in this way was not to run a cookie cutter, highly manualized type of approach. We wanted to have skilled practitioners who were able to, as I say, spontaneously respond to the needs of their coachees, and for that we needed folks that had a decent amount of experience, but also good solid conceptual training and skill development as well. And so from the point of view of what we were trying to do within the study, that was important, but also from the point of view of the one of the major stakeholders in the research, which was UTC. We wanted to make sure, whilst they left us alone to do the research, and they were a wonderful collaborator in that regard, we still wanted to make sure that they were receiving a decent coaching service at the end of the day. And so taking coaches with that profile allowed both of those things to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. There's several questions coming in about ultimately the implications for the workplace and for coaching in the workplace, which I'll integrate a couple of questions and maybe ask in the last minute that we have here as we're wrapping up. Just quickly, what would be your recommendations to employers and to managers, coming out with the understanding that you have through this project in terms of employers that are thinking about bringing in coaching programs into their workplace based on what you've found?
And so how long have we got for that? About a minute?
30 minutes. Yeah, 30 seconds, sorry.
Okay, I'll have a quick go at it, and then Chris can have a quick go at it. I think for me, the notion of need supportive coaching, the notion of need supportive management and leadership practice, I mean, these are easy words to utter. The process, though, of doing this is quite nuanced. It's quite tricky, and it also takes time. I think for organisations, I think there's a tendency to hear these words and to believe that more of it is being done than is actually the case in reality. Being need supportive really requires quite a degree of, I think it requires a lot of mindfulness. It requires a slowing down of what is typical for people in terms of the way in which they interact and relate to others. These are not easy things to do in high pressurized, chaotic, complex environments. So what I'm hopeful of is that some of the research will shine a light on the importance of need support, need satisfaction as preconditions or antecedents for important things like engagement. And that it will help organisations, managers and leaders to really tune into this in a more perhaps substantial way than has been the case in the past.
Well, wonderful. And we have come to the end of our webinar, and I really appreciate the presenters, and thank you, Gordon and Chris, for sharing your work with us, the work that's you've been conducting over the past few years, and we really look forward to the next steps and your publications. And I also see that your emails are here on the slide, so I'm sure that people will get in touch with you who'd like to discuss the topics further. Thank you to all participants for joining us today. And
can I just add, Irina, that if people, we would love it if people would contact us with questions and anything that they might be interested in, because whilst we have started writing these projects up, and we're not finished with that yet, and people's questions are a really useful stimulus for helping us to clarify our own thinking and to present and articulate the work in ways that are going to be not only useful scientifically but also from a practical standpoint. So I really would encourage people to do that if they have questions that we haven't been able to cover in the time that we've had today.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you, Stephanie, also for helping us conduct the webinar and for facilitating. And good night to everyone, or yes, have a wonderful day or a wonderful evening. And we look forward to hearing you and seeing you in our future webinars at the Institute of Coaching. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.